One last thing I want to say about this format that we're using now. We call it a walk through an art museum. And if you've done that, you know that typically rooms in art museum are clustered around certain styles of art. But you walk from one room to another, and it's like interplanetary travel because the styles can be dramatically different. The premises of the art can be radically different. So that's our premise here, is that we're trying to make some sense out of these kind of clustered visual experiences and see some deeper resonance in contrast. So, and my experience has always been contrast helps me remember things. And that's our premise here as well. Today you're going to see a very, very big contrast. Not all of our contrasts are generational, as we're going to see today and we saw last week. Some of the contrasts we're going to look at, Jen and I just finished a lecture the other day in which we have two artists of the same, coming from the same part of the world and the very same area and very same time, Vermeer and Rubens. And you couldn't find two more different artists. And that's our fourth lecture. We're going to be talking about them. We're starting today with a German Romantic landscape painter, David Caspar Friedrich, and we're contrasting him to the 20th century painter Jackson Pollock. Friedrich is what we call a romantic painter. Can we see the first image? As you can see, he brings religious and moral values to nature, but the critical part of understanding this romantic idea is romantic in reference to the visual arts basically means not the same thing as we think of romantic love. It does, in fact, have reference to strong emotion like we associate with romantic love. But it basically means another time, another place. And Romanticism was a reaction to the Industrial Revolution. All of a sudden the world is changing really dramatically. The Industrial Revolution is roughly dated around 1750, at least as its beginning. And what happened was it changed the world so dramatically that the European mind had a heck of a time adjusting to this new world. It was kind of a cultural shock, just like the kind of cultural shock we're undergoing right now as we start to kind of confront the implications of AI. All of a sudden the world doesn't make sense in the way it used to because this new development is starting to surround us. Well, that's what happened with the Industrial Revolution. And so most romantic artists thought of another time and another place in terms of nature, because what was happening is the Industrial Revolution was destroying nature, ripping it apart, literally. And all of a sudden, artists started to think about nature as something to be valued, Before this time, nature was not seen in a romantic way at all. It's sort of something you have to overcome to survive. But with some of the comfort developments associated with the Industrial Revolution, all of a sudden you start to think about nature as something we're losing, and boy, we're going to miss it. I can't help but think of Joni Mitchell's song about paving paradise and putting up a parking lot. It's that same kind of sensibility. That's what Romanticism is. And sometimes the artist painted different countries, different times, anything but here and now. The contrasting word, if you want to remember the meaning of Romanticism, is realism. Realism means here and now, just the reverse of Romanticism. Well, let's now take a look at Friedrich's work. You'll notice I always include measurements. Sometimes Jana and I really have to work to find these measurements. But the scale of art is really an important part of its expressive character. And you're going to see a dramatic contrast today in scale. You look at this painting across beside the Baltic. It's 17.5 inches by 13 inches. All of Friedrich's work is pretty small. And all of Pollock's work is generally pretty huge. Now, the thing Friedrich does with his landscapes, and I started with this image, because he tries to bring religious and moral values to nature. He uses nature as a sort of teaching device, and thinking of the Spirit of God as being in nature, and nature can teach us moral values. And so the very fact that you see the cross in this kind of peculiar location will sort of alert you to that fact. Now, another thing you want to be aware of as we go through Friedrich's work is that landscape painting in the area when he was painting cannot be done on location. All of these landscapes we're going to look at today are made up. They might have some reference to the real world, but they're all painted in the studio. During Friedrich's era, artists still had to compound their own colors. It was a very complicated thing to do oil painting. If you're a landscape painter, all you could do is go out to a site and draw on that site, or maybe do watercolor on that site. Both drawing and watercolor were portable. But it took Impressionism and the era of Impressionism to all of a sudden give us paint in tubes, and now artists can go on location and paint on location. Among other things, you'll see Friedrich's paintings have an incredible exactitude about them. A couple of them, you'll swear you're looking at a photograph. Now, that kind of exactitude can't be achieved in a natural environment with the wind and the rain and the dust and whatever. That can only be done in a studio. But anyway, Friedrich's work will have the quality you see here, a kind of calm, totally still environment with almost no action happening. Now, there's another thing that gives this painting a certain kind of religious tone that you may not immediately notice. Even though it's nature, you'll notice he plants a cross right in the center axis of the image. Most religious art, not all of it, but especially ancient religious art, generally relies on symmetry. As a religious artist myself, a lot of my work uses symmetry, because symmetry is slightly unnatural. It relies on the real world, but it's positioned the world in a way that's more formal, more stiff, more important looking. And you'll see symmetry throughout Friedrich's work. Can we see the next one, please? This is one of his largest paintings, and the reason it's as large as it is because it was used on the altar of a church. It, of course, has this rather elaborate frame. And again, you see the cross motif. This time, you have Christ on the cross. Again, this was used as an altar in a church. But try to imagine a painting like this. And by the way, its reception was kind of mixed when it was put up. But try to imagine in a modern day worship situation, a presentation like this. It mixes metaphors. It mixes the pinnacles of nature, the hill and the pointed pine trees, or those are spruces, I think. And then but the cross is above all of that. And so you've got the presentation of nature and this religious presentation, and the two are talking to each other. They're shaping each other. It's a kind of unique vision to nature. You know, he didn't see nature as red in tooth and claw. He saw nature as a place of calm and solace. Can we see the next one, please? He doesn't back away from a darker vision of life, because sincere faith doesn't do that. It faces up to death and darkness and difficult things. And winter scenes are fairly common in his work. If you look carefully at this particular image, Graveyard Under the Snow, look carefully at the foreground. You see a couple shovels sticking up there. That's actually a grave that's being dug in the winter time. You have what appears to be an entrance to a cemetery in this big stone gate, and then some other wood shapes that I'm not sure exactly what they represent. I don't think they would be grave markers. But in any case, you notice how they're kind of tilted. And notice, of course, because he represents this in the wintertime, you've got all these trees behind that wall that the gate is in, and of course they have no leaves on them. And so he's really a very modern artist when he thinks about composition. He's really very thoughtful about the complex, linear, lacy look of those trees behind that massive wall, and then the very simple shapes in the foreground. So the painting has a lot of visual interest to it, but it's not what you'd call a cheerful, happy kind of painting you would probably want in your living room. And a lot of his paintings have this darker quality about them. And again, now look at the size. 12 inches by 10 inches. You know, he had to be using microscopic brushes practically. Can we see the next one, please? Again, nature represented in kind of austere, quiet, reflective, meditative moments. Two men contemplating the moon, as if the moon is something to be contemplated. And again, the composition is very dramatic with the dark foreground, the two figures just silhouetted in that foreground, and then a kind of odd-colored sky that has kind of a pinkish and purplish sort of tinge to it, and you barely see the moon there. Again, not a dramatic moment in nature, a quiet, reflective moment. Think of the noise and so on of the Industrial Revolution and the smoke and the grime and so on. And then look at this scene and you see it's not directly reflecting the world at all. And by the way, this eventually became a problem for him. He died impoverished. He made about, as far as we know, about 500 of these small paintings. And in his early career, he was highly respected, had patrons. He died a pauper because the world had moved on. This romantic moment of reverence for nature faded away. And he's one of these artists who go in and out of favor every so often. As I say, at the end of his life, he couldn't sell a painting. But other artists have had that experience. Rembrandt, believe it or not, went out of favor in the 19th century. Took the 20th century to kind of revive Rembrandt. And the whole idea of this kind of treatment of nature just sort of became boring, became passé. What happened later on was the Nazis they hated modern art, absolutely hated modern art. They had exhibits called degenerate art that showed the work of Klee and Miro and Picasso and several of the modern artists. And they saw art like this that represented a very high level of craft and having a very conservative kind of approach towards the visual experience. And they worshiped this kind of stuff. They played it against the modern experience. And so he became out of favor again. But then when National Socialism went away, Nazism went away, all of a sudden people started to realize that was just a kind of cultural aberration. And in fact, this guy really has something in what he's doing. So he's back in favor again. Can we see the next one? I think I showed, those who've seen these lectures before, I think I showed you this work before. When I first saw it, I was sure I was looking at a photograph. You notice it's actually larger than some of his other work. The painting actually has 3 titles. This particular image shows it as the polar sea. Sometimes it's called the wreck of the Hope. And if you look carefully, off to the right-hand side of the image, you see the stern of the Hope crushed by these huge blocks of ice. You notice date-wise, this is done later in his life. And when he's starting to lose popularity and influence and patronage. Nature is the beginning, represents a kind of earthly kind of presentation of the power of God. Remember, it's a metaphor for God in his work. And you can see in this particular image how nature, these blocks of ice creating these cascading kind of mountains, totally overwhelm this human endeavor represented by that ship buried in the ice. It might actually be historical. I'm not sure which polar exposition this would have been a part of, but sometimes it's called the wreck of the Hope because the word hope is actually on the back of the ship. In this image, you don't see that very clearly, but I've seen other images where you can see the words there. He probably chose that particular ship, whether historical or not, to get his point across. That no matter how powerful we think we are with this industrial world we're producing, nature can still overwhelm us. That ultimately becomes the message here. But what a brilliant painting in terms of composition, color relationships. Again, look how modern it looks. If it didn't tell you about the ship there, it'd look like a totally modern painting. Now I think we have one more Friedrich, do we not? Yes. This is one of my favorite Friedrichs. We had to search to find this one. It's not very well known. Again, look at the scale, not very big at all. The painting becomes a kind of meditation on endurance. He chooses the winter to represent the painting. And you look below this tree that has been damaged and ruined. It obviously got big enough to be a mature tree, but then the weather had done its worst to it, and you see how many branches are on the ground. But if you look at the lower section there, it's still alive. And so it's a kind of moral presentation of endurance, of human endurance. No matter what you've undergone, you're still standing straight. You know, he just created, who knows whether there was ever a tree like this. He paints so accurately, you believe you're looking at a photograph, and you believe in the image, but the image is coming out of his brain. But it's also coming out of his soul, a kind of moral vision. And as far as we know, he lived a well-behaved, circumspect life. And I mention that because the next artist we're going to look at, in major contrast to Friedrich, did not live a well-behaved, circumspect life. Can we see the next one, please? Jackson Pollock was he's normally called a abstract expressionist. And by the way, we have an error in our image there. He's American, but not from Montana, but he's from Wyoming. But of course out west. As you can see, he lived a rather short life. He died in an auto accident, speeding. He had a big convertible Oldsmobile. He was racing around with two women, not his wife, and he was drunk, went off the road, killed himself and one of the women. One of the paramours survived. He, as I say, he was an alcoholic his whole life, lived a rather up and down life, as you would imagine, came from Wyoming, eventually settled in New York, and got the attention of one of the major patronesses of art in the 20th century, Peggy Guggenheim. She was part of a major wealthy family. Some of you might be aware of the fact that there is a Guggenheim museum just built by Frank Gehry in Bilbao, Spain, that is part of the family heritage, and of course there's a Guggenheim in New York as well. He was a part, you notice he's called an abstract expressionism, but abstract expressionism grew out of a style we call surrealism. We referred to that style a little bit last week. Surrealism had this idea that you should start to try to paint the subconscious. I mentioned last week Salvador Dali would be a good example, well-known surrealist. The idea behind surrealism is you don't plan the painting ahead of time. You simply paint your consciousness. It's sort of like, at the same time, surrealism, by the way, at first was a literary movement. And stream of consciousness writing was a part of the approach. But painters started to get into this, and so painters started paint that way. Trying to paint automatically, that's what automatism means. Painting without forethought, simply starting and then reacting to what you're doing. Anyway, he thought about that, and as I say, he was directly involved with it. There were some major surrealists that left Europe, the troubled time in Europe, and they came to America in the 30s. And of course, they landed in New York. So he interacted with some of those major surrealists, and they were talking about this idea of automatism. But he started to think about it, and he said, well, if you're representing images, and in fact most surrealist paintings, if you've seen Dali's work especially, are very carefully painted. You can't tell me that painting was done automatically when it's got that level of skill and craft as a part of it. He said there's got to be a much more direct way of dealing with automatism. And so, of course, these artists came from Europe, and they came from the high culture of Europe. Here's this cowboy in New York coming up with a much more direct way of doing this. Let's get rid of all this cultural fluff and all this history. Let's really paint automatically. And one of the first things he's got to do is figure out a technical way to do that. First of all, to paint really actively automatically, the painting can be vertical. It can't be on an easel. It's got to be on the floor. It's got to be on the floor because he wants to work with liquid paint that is relatively quick drying, not traditional oil paints. Now, during the time he painted, in the late 40s and 50s, they were developing new formulas for paint. You might have heard of a paint called Chemtone. That was an early water-based wall paint. He would go to the hardware store for his art supplies rather than the traditional art store. Now, one of the things people really don't know about canvas and paint is oil paint rots canvas. You can't oil paint directly on canvas because oil will eventually rot it. All the oil paintings you see first had a white layer of a chalky paint on that surface to keep the oil from resting against the canvas. Sometimes it's cotton canvas, sometimes it's linen canvas. But anyway, typically what you would do to prepare a canvas is you would paint it with a glue and then put a gouache or a white chalk-like paint on top of that, and then you do your oil painting. He worked with unsized canvas, so he would take liquid paint, buckets of paint, just like you buy at the hardware store, and drip them on the surface. So he wanted some control of the drips. As rough as these paintings look, believe it or not, he exercised a certain level of control there. And by having it horizontal, he could control exactly where the drip was. Rather vertical, it would run down the surface. Now he also included things in the paint surface beyond the traditional materials. So sand, broken glass, small bits of gravel get incorporated to some of these paint surfaces because he wants a certain amount of texture in the surface. He wants the painting to be a real direct experience. Remember, the whole concept here is directness. Painting automatically without forethought and doing it in the direct, fastest possible way. Now what I'm doing is I'm talking to you about all this technical side of it, is to help you understand why in the heck I've included him under the heading of landscape. Partly it grows out of this quote you see here, "I am nature." Remember, he wants this painting to be as natural and automatic and unpretentious as possible. And so the painting itself becomes a landscape. And because of that, as you'll see, I think is our first image blue poles? I think it is. Oh, I'm sorry. This is a painting he did. He was still working with a brush with this painting, but it's highly influenced by the European surrealists, and it's a vertical painting done in oil like a traditional painting would be. This is before he got into his drip technique. And if you look carefully And you have to really look carefully. You can see potential images here of subject matter. I don't have my red button. That looks like a fish to me up there. These elements, of course, look very much plant-like. So it has a floral, natural look about it. Again, it's nature, but a much wilder vision of nature than you would have seen in Friedrich's work. And by the way, as rough as these things look, if you're trained in visual analysis, and I used to teach a course in visual analysis, it's the same thing as if you were a trained musician. I used to be a dean of the School of Music, so we had a composition course in the music curriculum. And music is a technically much more complex art form than the visual arts are. But the visual arts have their structural elements as well. They're not as numerically based as musical patterns are. But we teach students how to understand color and shape and line. And I'm going to give you a sort of mini design course as we talk about Pollock, because you're only going to understand his painting if you start to understand the structural side of it. Ultimately, Pollock's work ends up being the end of modernism. As we move along here, you'll see that his general overall look, as we see in this work, is a kind of nervous, frenetic energy, a kind of busyness. Again, that might represent the kind of fruitfulness of nature, sort of pulsing life. And you notice the element that he uses most here is line. You see all the black marks, all the black lines here in this work. Line communicates motion in a very unique way, because to make a line is simply a record of a point moving through space. So in order to make a line, you have to move. When we see linear elements, we see controlled motion. Our whole legal system is based on this. My wife and I just did our wills, and we had to sign the wills. In fact, we had to use blue ink for some reason. Don't ask me why it had to be blue. But anyway, those particular motions we make are characteristic to us, and therefore they become foundational in our legal system. Pollock's work is motion everywhere, but none of it coordinated in the simple way. Think of the solitary oak. Sure, there's a tangled branches and so on at the bottom, but you had that symmetrical spike going through that painting to give it a kind of dignity and order. Here you see Pollock takes away all of those kinds of crutches, and it simply becomes a tangled thing that you have to kind of respond to in a kind of visceral way. And maybe it's got subject matter in it, but maybe it doesn't. None of it's explicit enough to say exactly what it is. Now, can we see the next one, please? And by the way, look at the size of that. 4 foot by 6 foot. All his work starts to get large. Can we see the next one? How do you title a drip painting which has no subject matter? He gave up eventually titling them, and he started to number them. His dealers sometimes came around the studio while he was working and suggested titles to him because they had to sell these things. And a title that in some ways evoked a response for a potential patron made it easier to sell than a number. So some of these titles, Autumn Rhythm was probably painted in the autumn. Look at the scale, 8 foot by 8 foot 8 inches by 17 feet 3 inches. It's quite a bit bigger than the image on the screen. And again, you see the premise I'm working from. It's a landscape in itself. It's a landscape of Pollock's creativity and personal energy. Again, the linear rhythms here. Notice the title, Rhythm, Autumn Rhythm. And you get these big loopy rhythms, and the autumn title comes partly from the brownish, orangish colors as a part of the painting. Now, the one issue that always becomes a part of looking at a Pollock is, couldn't anyone in this room do something like this?
It'd be fun.
You know, in technical sense, everyone in this room could do this.
Yeah.
You wouldn't be able to bring the structural integrity to it, the formal integrity to it that Pollock did. And you probably wouldn't have any commitment to it the way he did, because it wouldn't be a personal meaning to you. But it looks like anyone could make something like this. And so once Pollock passed away, remember he passed away as a relatively young man, his work skyrocketed in value. And what typically would happen is someone would claim that they found lost Pollocks. Now, almost all of those lost Pollocks have been discredited, mostly because of the fact that he bought his paints at the hardware store. And the paint companies changed their formula over time. And most of these lost Pollocks were painted in the 70s and 80s when these paintings started to get millions of dollars. There's one of them. I dropped a few jaws last week when I told you about the Giacometti pointing man sculpture, 141 million. There's one Pollock that went for 200 million. Well, wouldn't you try to replicate something like this? So anyway, these lost Pollocks get somewhat discredited. Strangely enough, these things are almost impossible to replicate. So if you have a good photographic record of this painting, that surface is so complex and so busy, you couldn't personally, I don't care how hard you tried, replicate every one of those marks on that surface exactly like that. So it's almost impossible to copy, but of course the way around that is finding these lost Pollocks. Some of them were found in a locker in Grand Central Station. You know, go figure. Can we see the next one, please? I chose this one because I wanted you to see the painting in relationship to an observer. This one, of course, is called Blue Poles. For some reason or other, I've seen the real painting. There are a couple versions of this painting, but the poles never seem to photograph as blue. The real painting I've seen, the poles actually are blue. But in any case, one of the reasons I'm calling this landscape, if you stand where this young woman stands, and imagine yourself looking at that painting, all you're going to see is that painting. That painting is a landscape in itself. Needless to say, the energy represented in that landscape is more of a tornadic kind of energy rather than the sweetness of the dew of dawn. Anyway, it's very hard to fully explain to someone who hasn't had an education in formal structure what's great about these paintings. The poles themselves, in this particular case, create a kind of foreground element because they're so simple in relationship to everything that's behind them, and because their color so stands out. And then you have this complex tumult behind them. But you'll notice again, he creates a rhythm with them that sort of dance across that surface in a rhythm. In an odd way, the paintings seem chaotic, but if you stand in front of them like this young woman does, as I have done, they're strangely calming. The problem with this whole style is, where do you go from here? You know, modernism has keep pulling away various barriers, various ways of doing things, and revealing more and more structural aspects of the visual arts. So finally get to this point, the only one can really understand it is a fellow artist. And where do you go from here? There's almost nothing to add. It's no accident that the art after Pollock started to move back towards subject matter, started to move back towards technique. Can we see the next one, please? You'll sneer a little bit at my next comment, but unfortunately this painting is out of focus. And you'll say, who gives a damn? But it is. It's out of focus a little bit. Again, I've actually read the commentary about this one, and a dealer gave it this title, Lavender Mist, because it does have the color of lavender, and it's such a complex surface that it almost doesn't become individual lines and shapes. It simply becomes a kind of atmospheric look about it. It's, you know, think of Blue Poles with the big dramatic rhythm of those things bouncing across that surface. You see how this one has a very different character. It's a much quieter, softer character. Doesn't hurt at all that it's out of focus, because the whole painting itself is meant to be a softer statement than the last one we just saw. And again, look at the scale. Significantly bigger than what you see on the screen. The next one, please. Here he's numbering now. This is 17A. not as big as most of the other work we've seen. And a lot of people don't, all they do is see color in Pollock paintings, but they don't think about color having value. Value is darkness and lightness. All colors also have value. Yellow, for instance, is lighter than purple. Purple is the darkest spectrum color, and yellow is the lightest. He plays with value in his paintings because his paintings become a weaving of space. So you've got whites coming out. That's the lightest value in this painting. Blacks going back, that's your deepest value. And so you've got a sort of spatial framework that's established by your whites and your blacks. One's the most extreme forward, one's the most extreme back. And then each color has its own distinct value and intensity, and they weave into each other in a middle plane. Now, I see it that way because I've been trained to understand how value and color works. You haven't been, so I'm probably talking nonsense to most of you.
Okay.
Can we see the next one, please? This is one of my favorite Pollocks. Again, it's not terribly large. You know, my favorites are these lacy, delicate paintings that are simultaneously violent and gentle. I love that quality of contrast in them. Great art often does represent the spectrum of emotion. It isn't all just quiet and it isn't all just violent. And you could see that in the Michelangelos I showed you last week. Now, I think we have one more, don't we, Jenna?
That's the last one.
Is that it? Okay. I've been trying to keep my eye on my watch, and we've got 5 minutes left. Can I help you with any questions here? Yes, Ed.
Do you know how Pollock started and finished the paintings? Did he start in the middle and work out? Did he start outside and work in?
I don't think he was quite as systematic as that. I've seen photographs of him painting films, and he typically, he has it on the floor, and he works around the painting as it's laying on the floor. Remember, it doesn't have stretchers or anything like that. It gets framed only after it's done. And he's got his paint bucket. Sometimes he pours it, sometimes he has a hole in the bottom of it and swings it over the painting. He has sticks, he has brushes that he's allowed the paint to harden on, so they no longer brush. He dips them in the bucket of paint and throws that and creates a kind of linear structure that way. There actually is a technique here, as crude as it sounds. There is a pattern, there is a kind of technical approach towards this. Once that surface gets going, it's pretty hard to stand on it because it's all wet. You know, it's going to take a while to dry. Most of these paints dry within an hour or two. So he tends to work around the perimeter, but keep in mind he's making this up as he goes along. He probably only keeps one of 3 or 4 paintings. the very fact that he has a standard like that will tell you that this is not just as chaotic as it may seem to you. He has judgments he makes, whether this one came off or didn't come off. There was a burn pit in the back behind his barn. He painted on the floor of his barn. A lot of paintings got burned back there.
Did he do it in one go, most of them, the smaller ones?
I'm not really sure. My guess is they probably are done all at once. They certainly look like that, because he's trying to keep a kind of energy going with his marks and his use of color. And so, you know, for the painting to be automatic, the minute you stop, you can't help but think about, what did I do? He wants that thinking process to be the making process, not a reflective process. So my guess is most of them are done pretty much all in one setting. And, you know, some of them, in fact, one has to be realistic, are done in an alcoholic binge. Any other questions? Yes.
I've been on a tour of the Dayton Art Institute with a docent where she talked about Jackson Pollock. I think they were having a Pollock special show. And the stuff he would stick on them, whatever he used was giving way and things were falling apart.
Yeah, that's right.
And
Yeah.
what was it that he used?
The preservation has been a big issue with these paintings. Yeah, yeah. Some of them are just deteriorating because they were done so spontaneously. As I say, he was a rough guy. You know, I remember I'm trying to help you remember these things by contrast. Can you think of a bigger contrast than Friedrich working on these meticulous little landscapes, spending who knows how long to work on a painting so big, and Pollock with what he does? But they're both landscape painters in an odd way. Yeah, yes.
Was he also a pauper at the time he crashed his car, or did he have money?
No, I didn't hear all of it. What about cracking cars?
When he died in an auto accident.
Yes, an Oldsmobile, by the way.
Yeah, so he must have
Oldsmobile.
Oldsmobile.
Yeah, oh yeah. During his lifetime, he eventually did become quite wealthy. And by the way, I mean, the guy looks like a kind of caricature of the Western macho man. Lee Krasner was his wife. He would have never been important and famous unless his wife, she had the contacts with the galleries. She was the one, she actually married him, but at the end of their relationship, he was messing around, as I say. He had a couple other women in the car with him when he died. But she actually was, and by the way, she ended up being an abstract painter as well. She was actually better known than him when they married. She was showing in a better gallery in New York than he was. And so there's been a new appraisal of her work because the kind of fame that he generated with his wild behavior and technique sort of put her in the shadows. And people are starting to realize, wait a minute, there was a real talent here. It's about time, I think. I'll be willing to ask one question here.
Did either one of these sign their paintings? Did they think about identifying?
Typically, he did sign his paintings, and one of there was a funny little story. Knoedler Gallery were trying to sell some of these lost Pollocks. And by the way, it was a major, Knoedler was the major gallery in New York City. And how she got caught up in this Pollock frenzy. One of the reasons we discovered that it was a made-up Pollock She actually had it in her office, the head person in that gallery. His name was misspelled. His name has 2 L's in it, and this particular painting is Pollock spelled with 1 L. And we later discovered it was a Chinese artist who was actually a very gifted copyist, and he never got arrested because he left town and went back to China before any of this got discovered. Okay, thank you for coming again, folks.
Thank you.
Hope to see you next week.